Good morning. Welcome to today's GRAD and Postdoc scholarly talk series on teaching. I haven't done this one before, so we'll see how it goes. Teaching is really a work in progress for me. As you can tell, I'm not very old, but it is something that I think about a lot because I lecture 3 times a week, 2 or 3 times a week, and I've taken many lectures, lecture-based courses. I attend many lectures, so maybe something that I'll say in the next 45 minutes or so will help you in either your career as a TA, but if it doesn't end as a TA and you go on into academics and you're teaching professionally, maybe it will help you there too. So that's the goal. Okay, university education is under a bit of pressure because we have these massively open online courses or MOOCs, and there's this general notion that why should we just sit in a classroom and learn from the person who knows something about that topic at your institution when we could just download the lecture from the best person teaching that topic and then get the degree from our home institution? There's a lot of ways in which technology is sort of disrupting, as the 21st century likes to say, disrupting education, and what can we actually do to make the best use of our time? Because there's this notion that this typical lecture in a university sort of follows this maxim, that a lecture is the process by which the notebook of the professor gets transferred to the notebook of a student while passing through the brains of neither. And there's some controversy over who said this for the first time, but I'm going to attribute it to Mark Twain, just like we'll attribute pretty much anything that was ever clever to either Mark Twain or Yogi Berra. But the quoteinvestigator.com has a long article on where this quote originated. Okay, here's my quote. My duty to my students is to do unto them that which was done unto me. That's not necessarily what I follow, but it's sort of the expectation when a professor graduates from professor school. Just kidding, there's no such thing. And they go to teach. They're generally not trained as to how to convey information and deep insights and usefulness about the material to the classroom. So the default is just to talk at the lecture hall the same way that was done to them and have homeworks and exams in much the same way. I'm not saying that my approach differs all that much from this approach, but there are some there are better and worse ways to do this. When I was a student, for at least half of the classes that I took, my attitude was just to suffer through the lecture so that I could get home or back to the dorm room to learn it on my own. Like my experience going to college lectures, especially in, let's say, I'm going to be arbitrary here, 50% of the time, the equations were just written on the board and things went over my head, and I didn't really get it until I went home and studied it. Maybe people in the audience are different, but how many of you have had that experience? And it's okay, almost everybody. It's a pretty common experience. And it often doesn't occur to people teaching in the STEM fields that there is a community of people who study the way that people learn. And it's not often reflected in the courses that you go to because it takes time to change your behavior. And there are evolving roles of all of the different parts of the lecture. Of the course. There's the lecture, the homeworks and exams, the textbook, peers. So peers are something that you get in a university education where you don't necessarily get in a MOOC. So how, as an instructor, do you encourage sharing between peers? And it's important to think about, why are we doing what we're doing? Is there a good reason for particular behaviors that we have when we teach, or particular things that we do, that we present in front of the class? I think we can all agree that there are many ways that instructors are ineffective, and if we minimize the items on the bulleted list I'm going to show you now, we can probably at least get into the category of above average teaching. So the common causes of ineffective lectures, the number one common cause is the curse of knowledge. So often a professor will know a topic so well that it doesn't even occur to her or him that the people in the class, the students in the class, are seeing the information for the first time, and they go too fast, and they don't have empathy and compassion for the fact that the students have never seen this information before. They could be inaudible or too quiet. I think we've also all been in that scenario before. They could talk right or go through the slides too fast. In particular, slides are a culprit of ineffective lecturing. So let's get a show of hands. The first show of hands will be who prefers chalkboard for engineering classes and who prefers PowerPoint. So chalk, PowerPoint. Let the record show that the ratio is approximately 80% in favor of chalk, but the ratio in an actual classroom is probably more like 50-50 PowerPoint. The problem with PowerPoint is that it allows us to go way too fast, in my opinion. The instructor could write illegibly, introduce too many concepts in one lecture. They could just be boring. Like, how many of you have ever tuned out during a lecture? How many of you have tuned out at some point for every lecture in an entire course? How many of you have tuned out for the entire lecture for more than 20% of the courses you've ever taken? It's okay, we're all friends here. The expectations might not be clear. There could be inconsistencies between the homework, exams, and lecture material, and if you're not used to seeing the material before, you'll be very frustrated by this. And the professor could be inaccessible, frequent absences, traveling too much, or the worst is just, frankly, unprepared. I would look like a troglodyte to my teaching peers if I didn't mention the concept of the flipped classroom and peer learning. This is a popular space in which to innovate in education. So the idea, I believe, is originally attributed to Eric Mazur at Harvard, who's a physics professor. And the idea is, what do you use the classroom for? So the class time, a regular lecture, is the sage on stage. The instructor is just giving facts and facts and facts, and is just conveying the information. So the notebook of the professor gets transferred to the notebook of the student while going through the brains of neither as it goes. But while you're listening and writing, you can't think. So the student has to internalize the information and learn deep concepts that are not easy, while at the same time trying to furiously write down notes and also listen. So the theory is, in practice, if you use the class time in a STEM course in a more Socratic way, where you ask questions and then you have the students interact among themselves, then the students are going to be better at explaining it to their colleagues, their classmates, than the professor is, because the professor has known the information for 20 to 50 years, whereas the student is just learning it for the first time. So you have a better chance of learning from somebody who just learned it than you do from the professor. That's how the theory goes. In practice, what's done is you assign reading and hard homework ahead of time. And my comment here is, wouldn't it be great if all students had the discipline and time to read before coming to class? Many of you have probably had the experience, as I have, that, okay, this course, the professor said I'm going to read ahead of time before coming to class, like they say 50% of the time, and maybe you do for the first week and then you never do again, because maybe there's too much detail in the book and you don't actually need it to do well on the exams, which of course is the whole point of taking a class. Homework must be turned in at the start of class, and class is a series of questions and answers, the Socratic method, possibly with the aid of clickers. So this is regarded as quite an innovation in STEM education. So math, science, lectures, this is innovative. But in literature and history classes and law classes and business classes, this is how they have always done it, or how they've done it for the last several decades, the so-called case method that's used in basically all law schools and all business schools, where you're expected to read the case before coming to class, and then the class time is actually used as discussion. So science, engineering, and mathematics is pretty much the only holdout where the vast majority of information is given in lectures in the traditional way, the same way that it's been done for centuries. And what you do, the key finding of the peer instruction method is that so I ask you a question, and there's multiple choice on the board, and you use the clicker to answer the multiple choice question. Then I ask you to confer among yourselves, with yourselves, amongst yourselves for a few minutes, and then you poll the class again, and the number of correct answers goes way up. So this is the technique in action. The rationale is that students are better teachers than the professors because the students just learned it, whereas the professor has known it forever. In my opinion, I've had some serious difficulties using this method, and one of them is that it's very difficult to decouple the effects of, if you force the class to read before coming to class by having the homework of the material that hasn't been covered in lecture yet due, then of course they're going to do better. So it's hard to decouple the peer instruction effect. And what it does is that it assumes that lecturing is never useful. So what's the point of having a professor on stage who has learned their craft for decades when the only thing you're going to do is show questions and have answers and have the students teach themselves? So there's maybe a little bit of a contradiction there. And also, the lecture could also be, how many of you have had great professors? How many of you have had instructors that have just explained something using a typical lecture format that you never would have thought of? You never would have thought of internalizing a scientific concept or mathematical concept or an engineering concept in quite that way. So do we abandon the lecture entirely? And I think it's too early to say that we should abandon the lecture format entirely. What is the art of teaching viewed from a research professor? There are really two kinds of university instructors. There are the kind that are teaching-oriented, that are more like Robin Williams from the Dead Poets Society, and there are those who are not hired on their ability to teach, and those are exemplified by Hubert Farnsworth from Futurama, who's famously quoted as saying, I don't teach, I'm a professor. So there are really two types of professors. There are teaching faculty at UCSD. Generally, they teach 3 courses per year, and they're appointed for their teaching ability, and they're in general awesome teachers. There are research faculty who teach probably 3 to 4 classes per year, and they also do research, as we know, and they are not appointed for their teaching ability. And the teaching ability of the research faculty spans a very wide range. I think we can all agree with that. The research faculty are judged in promotion on the basis of research, teaching, and service, and they collect a 9-month salary paid over 12 months, and the summer is supported with grants that are achieved through writing grants during the regular year and working on the research during the regular year, and then they get money on top of this if they have grants to support the extra 3 months. The incentive structure for research faculty to teach well is not very robust, and in some institutions it's better than in others. Actually, the incentive structure for good teaching at UCSD tends to be tends to reward. I was actually going to say something really nice, that it tends to reward teaching in the form of accelerated promotions and so forth. Now, in general, the effectiveness as a lecturer is given on some combination of the CAPE scores plus the average grade. So if you have great CAPE scores but give out all A's, then that looks suspicious. So the serious to teaching spans a very wide range among research faculty. Courses I've taught here have been nanoengineering, 202, Seng 212, intermolecular and surface forces. Now a little story time. How did I get my first teaching assignment? When I started here in the summer of 2012, there was a previous faculty member who had been hired by another university, and I took the. And there were holes in the teaching syllabus, or in the teaching schedule, so I had to fill those. One of those courses was intermolecular and surface forces. It was a course that I never had as a student, and it's a graduate class. Nano 103 was Foundations in Nanoengineering Biochemical Principles. Because my training was as a chemist, okay, I took 1 semester of biochemistry, so I can teach this. Then I wanted to make my life more difficult, so I volunteered to teach a philosophy of science course, which is a 1-unit lecture in Revelle College that I really got a lot out of teaching. It was really about Edward O. Wilson's concept of the unity of knowledge, and that was pretty fun. I haven't taught it since then. I've been teaching polymeric materials, which is cross-listed between 3 different departments for the last 3 years. I used to co-teach a graduate elective called Organic Nanomaterials, and this year for the first time I'm teaching Nano 101, which is our intro sophomore or transfer junior class on nanoengineering. Okay, so there are some high-level thoughts about how to give a lecture and how to structure a course from 2 people that I have a lot of respect for. One is Edward O. Wilson, who's an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, and he wrote an essay that I have the title of on the last slide that you can download, or I can send it to you if you email me. And his idea was teach from the top down. And this I think of as the Star Wars model. So you create bins in the students' minds for the facts to fill up. So if you're just teaching from the bottom up, like these are all the fundamentals, but we're not going to tell you why they matter, then here's what you can do with those fundamentals. It's more fundamental, then more fundamentals, and then maybe at the last week of class we'll talk about what you can do with those. Or maybe we won't talk about what you can do with what you learned at all. So it's better to create the context when you start a class. And I think I call this the Star Wars model because in the first Star Wars, that is A New Hope, definitely not The Phantom Menace, in A New Hope, they mentioned, like Obi-Wan mentions the Senate and the Republic and Luke's father and all of these unexplained details. And you just kind of take it for face value that eventually, like, yeah, that's interesting. I'm looking forward to learning more about what those things are. And the facts come. If they spent all this time explaining what the Force was and what Jedi were and what the Sith are, it would be like 2 hours in, and Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru would be like dead in hour 3 instead of like the first 30 minutes. Same thing with Game of Thrones. Nothing's better than the first season of Game of Thrones after you've watched all of the rest of them, because you finally learn why Jaime Lannister is the Kingslayer, who's Mance Rayder, and where does Valerian steel come from. So create bins, categories, applications to be filled later with facts. And this is true not only in the lecture that you're teaching, but also in the whole curriculum. You can have courses at the beginning of the curriculum that are filled in later with later courses in the curriculum. And that's what I try to do, for example, with Nano 101, which all of the second-year nanoengineering students have to take. Importantly, 50 minutes of time is too short to really internalize information and deep concepts. Your job as an instructor is, in some sense, to make the students interested in learning it at home. Because for just 150 minutes a week, you're really not going to get to, the students are really not going to get to the level of proficiency that one really expects, or that's really useful to them in their later career. Another person is George Whitesides, that I learned a lot from. And I'm not going to say whether he actually taught in exactly the way that is in his in this essay, but I think he largely did. I mean, he is a great teacher, but kind of traveled a lot, so there were a lot of guest lectures. But anyway, the idea is teach less, but teach it better. Don't worry about covering stuff. Just because you wrote it on the board doesn't mean you've taught it. I'm just going to write this on the board. And by the way, I'm guilty as hell at doing a lot of these things. But just because you wrote it on the board doesn't mean that the information has actually been conveyed. Just because it's on the board doesn't mean that it's actually entered into the class's long-term memory and useful abilities. The students might forget the details, but they'll retain the big concepts. And focus on building intuition, not just facts, but intuition for the topic. Because you're going to forget this equation and this equation and this equation, but you'll remember how a physical system works if the concept is taught from a conceptual level. This is the type of syllabus that I use. The resolution here is not good enough to make out everything, but what the important piece here, put the exam dates on the schedule, days that there are not class. Try to make the expectations as transparent as possible. So the homework was all posted, for example, the first week of class, and generally how to study for the course. And this is really important to undergraduate students. It becomes less important for graduate students, is grades and evaluation. So undergrads, this is really important to undergrads. Grad students, especially PhD students, nobody cares about your grades. Sorry. If you get any more than a B average, you're working too hard. Or rather, not spending enough time in lab. Okay, so I use two grading schemes, and I'll talk about this again later. And I think this is really important for the transparency of expectations, and also in keeping the students and the faculty member honest. So I use a curved score in which I assign, it depends on the course, depends on if it's an undergrad or grad course, and how difficult I think it is. But I rank the class top to bottom and distribute 30% A's, 30% B's, 30% C's, 5% D's, and 5% F's. And in the second method, so that guarantees some people are going to fail, but not everyone, not 5% of the class deserves to fail. 5 people in a class of 100, that's a lot of F's. I don't give that many F's, and people generally don't deserve. 5 people generally don't deserve F's. So I also use an absolute scale that says, okay, what if everybody in the class is equally prepared and able, and they all study just as hard? Should they all, if you get a 90% and you're in the bottom 5% of the class, you'll get an F by the first grading scheme, which totally isn't fair, right? So I use an absolute scale as well. So before class starts, I had to add these 93 to 100, 85 to 92.99. I actually had to add these significant figures on the end because I would have students say, well, I had 92.1 and you gave me an A minus. I think I deserve. So now I use more significant figures at some point, which is incorrect, by the way, because this implies that exams are graded to 4 significant figures when they're not. So forgive me there, 10th grade chemistry class. Okay, phone use during class, no phones during class. And then importantly, I have a policy on crying, and that is to say there's none of it. It doesn't stop people, but there it is. Okay, a little bit more about what I mean about transparent expectations. We all liked classes where we knew ahead of time, if not what was going to be on the exam, at least the level to which we were expected to prepare. And I think that yes, we want to challenge students on exams, but we also don't want the experience to be so exasperating that they throw their hands up and they get discouraged. So there's going to be a balance. The students appreciate it to have the expectations as transparent as possible. Similarity between the book and the lecture. If you're in my class right now, I'm very sorry about that because some of the variables are different in the book and the lecture, but that's because I switched books and haven't redone the lecture notes yet. Sorry. Availability of old, so do as I say, not as I do. Okay. Availability of old homework and exams. So this is something that a lot of instructors don't like to do because, frankly, it's hard to come up with new homework problems and new exam problems. It takes a lot of time. Tough. Tough for the professor. If an exam has been given out and you plan on recycling those questions for the next year's exams, those exam questions are compromised, and you give an advantage to someone whose roommate took the class last year. So don't do that. Producing new exams every year takes a lot of time, but it's good training for the TAs. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Cody. Also, old exams are inherently compromised, so I already said that. Great. Students should be able to calculate their grade, at least by my system, the lowest of their 2 possible grades, and make the lecture notes available online. That actually makes it easier to get more out of the lecture on the part of the student because they can just look at the lecture notes and kind of add in little annotations as you say something on stage. UCSD is nice that most of the classrooms are equipped with podcasting, so they'll record an MP3 of the audio, and some good fraction of classes of instructors at UCSD end up using this. I'm a big fan of it, not only for the students because they can go back and listen to it with the notes that you've already made in front of them, but it's really important for me too, so I can teach the class next year and tell the same jokes again, or get rid of the jokes that didn't work, and alert failing students. So this is a transparent expectation. If a student is not doing well, you should probably reach out to them. There might be a problem, there might not be, but there are systems in place at any university that there's a college provost or somebody that should probably be made aware. In your lectures or TA sessions or any public speaking you intend to do, err on the side of loudness. Speak clearly. Practice in the car. Some people practice by singing in a car. Not me, but a hypothetical person could do that. Begin each lecture with a monologue. This goes back into the teaching from the top down. So while you don't have to state in order exactly what you're going to talk about, at least explain the context and how today's lecture corresponds to something we've learned about previously. Students respond differently to professional clothing. So I've done a wide range of dress on stage, not a dress, but I've done a range of clothing, worn a range of clothing on stage, and it does matter how professional you appear in front of a group. It's like automatic authority to wear at least a collar for men or a suit for men and women, not like a full suit, but some kind of business casual thing. It actually does matter. I never took like a survey of the actual teaching effectiveness, but it's just my impression. Otherwise, this is important. You may, especially if you're starting out your career and you look young, or you are young, you may be confused for somebody who wants advice from somebody 15 years younger than you as to how you should teach. Be human as a professor. So yes, you are expected to know what you're talking about. And I have a slide on crisis mode in a moment for the times when you may not know what you're talking about and you're teaching a section or a lecture. But if you have a sense of humor, go ahead and use it. Try to make the class a little bit more delightful, because sitting in the same seat for 50 minutes or 80 minutes is hard, and people may want to text and read their email and stuff. An acceptable form of humor is something that's actually funny, or something that's sufficiently awkward and not funny to still be funny. Unacceptable is like barely funny or creepy. And my favorite kind of joke, absolute favorite kind of joke, are the ones where one person can't stop laughing and nobody else freaking gets it. If they don't get it, it's their loss. It's a little bit like layered, like layers, like music that you liked when you were 10 years old, and you listen to it again when you're 20, and then when you're 30, and you appreciate not only other parts of the music, but also the lyrics mean something to you now that they didn't mean to you then. So I like a layered lecture, especially now that I'm recording them all. Don't use the crappy Crayola chalk that they put in all the lecture halls. Have a little self-respect. The chalk in a normal lecture hall is like rail chalk, like the well chalk. You ask for a gin and tonic, you're getting Gordon's in a plastic bottle. But if you ask for Bombay Sapphire and tonic, they'll have to reach up and get it. Okay, what is it called? What's that cucumber gin? Hendrix. Yeah, then they have to get out the step stool. Okay, Hagoromo chalk, made in Japan, has this great laminate coating on it, and it creates a line that's almost as thick as those railroad chalks. Use this. They'll be a little more expensive, but trust me, you will cancel terms like you've never canceled terms before, like Zorro. If you have a whiteboard, don't ever touch the whiteboard with your finger. You know why? Because if you do this a couple times, it won't erase anymore, and then you'll have to get out the alcohol or the detergent to wipe it down. Also, the expo markers are good. They minimal, some VOC smell, but not like the Steelcase ones, which have a horrible toluene smell. Sorry, Steelcase. Okay, recording and course websites. So use of technology in lecturing. This is really useful. It actually makes the quality of a lecture, which is ordinarily only delivered once, a lot more to the up to the performance criteria that the best peer-led team learning gurus achieve, in my opinion. And the reason for this is because if you have the book and you have a really good lecture and the professor can explain things in a way that click in the students' minds, then you can use the pause function on the recording and think while you're also learning. So I always use the podcasts, and since January 2017, I've also put all my lectures online. And I have a lot of reasons for doing this. One of them is because it's a great teaching tool, because students can rewatch the videos, then they can use the pause button. They can even use the fast forward button, which is fantastic. Wish I could do that to live humans. This did not really affect attendance for Nano 101, probably because the students were sophomores, but in my junior senior level class, I would say that my attendance is way down because I have started to use the recordings. I'm not entirely happy about this, but if I can't come up with a compelling enough reason for why students should come to class, then that's still my failing. So I still need to do a better job of actually using the lecture. Otherwise, why don't I just record everything? Sometimes it's like, oh, 10 a.m., students just don't want to show up at 10 a.m. I don't know. I wasn't in school that long ago. I was an undergrad from 01 to 05. And back in my day, you had class, you went to class. But now that it's a minority opinion, apparently, among juniors and seniors. But again, it's my fault. If I can't come up with if I can't be a compelling enough lecturer or have a compelling enough reason to show up at the live class, then it's my fault. So I often don't record exam reviews since they're usually discussion-based, and because it's discussion-based, students get more out of it by actually being a part of the discussion. I use the website for grades, homework, and old exams, and I do as much of the website preparation as possible before the class even starts, and to save effort to batch tasks. So if you saw my lecture on efficient practices, like to combine like activities so that they don't upset your schedule that you have reserved for deeper work later on in the week. If you're in the position to double up on teaching, if you're on the semester system, teach 2 courses in the fall, if the normal load is 1 course per semester or quarter, that can actually help you in some circumstances, because while it's going to be a really difficult quarter or semester, you get the next quarter or semester totally off of teaching. And that could be fantastic for batching grant proposals or research papers or other, often travel to conferences and other activities. Okay, a few thoughts on exams and homework. This is the cover of the most recent exam I gave. After you write the exam, or the TA helps you write the exam, or the TAs help you write the exam, make sure you can do the exam in about a quarter of the time unaided, otherwise it's too hard. Have the teaching staff review the exam and the key. Give them the exam and the key. There's essentially always an error in the exams that I write before the TA, before Sam or Cody sees them. This is just what I have done in the more recent classes. Homework assignments about every 2 weeks seems to be a good clip. And in my opinion, if you have enough exams, the homework problems can be recycled. But you really have to encourage the students to do the homeworks before they either go to the TA office hour where they'll learn, well, they'll get the answers, or if you're going to post the solutions online, then there has to be some motivation, particularly in courses early on in the curriculum, like freshman, sophomore courses. You can't just give them the answers at the same time as the homework, but later on, I think students are especially grad students, are really there under their own volition and are going to do their best to try to learn. If the homework isn't going to be graded, you need more exams. Are exams the best way to measure student learning? That's not something I've wanted to reinvent yet. So I use more midterms if I'm not going to grade the exams, or if I use more exams if I'm not going to grade the homework. And the reason is just because the students will want to keep up on their own. And why not grade the homework? In part because of the administrative difficulty of doing all of the homework writing and the TA sessions and the professor office hours and grading 100 to 200 exams and writing new exam questions, because I don't want to recycle exam questions. The TAs, if you are at a rich private school, you'll have enough TA support to grade all the homeworks. So fear not. The TAs can use their office hours to go over the homework and the exams. Okay, grading. Above all else, be consistent in grading. If challenged, so if a student asks for a regrade, don't discuss it with them. Have them write a note, unless it's you added up the points wrong or the TA added up the points wrong, that can be dealt with. That can be discussed because there's basically no discussion. If there is a question about I lost too many points on this part of this problem, don't engage with them on that before you have the time to go through it in the quiet of your office, confer with the TAs or the graders, and make sure that it was graded as consistently as everybody else's. Don't engage with people trying to get their grade changed until you know what all the facts are. So have them write a note, submit the exam back to you for a regrade, and proceed from there. So in the two grading schemes that I showed on the syllabus, just a final note about that the curve tends to benefit the top performers, and the absolute score benefits the median or lower performers in the class. A little bit of cynicism here. Make the exams easy to grade, because your time and the TA's time is really valuable. And if you're spending 5 minutes per question per exam, that's going to take a week to do, and we don't have a week. Or use an easy grading scheme. Try to spend no more than 30 seconds per problem while maintaining absolute consistency. So this is a skill that takes quite a long time to learn, but the key is, above all else, be consistent, but don't spend a week grading the exam. I one time took a graduate class where the professor said, I don't grade in red pen because it hurts the feelings of the students. Because red is an aggressive color. It's like blood. So they graded everything in either blue or green ink. But the green kind of looks like black, right? And blue looks a little bit more like the black ink of the page. So one time I thought I was going to be all nice and cheerful, and I graded the first exam I ever gave in green ink, and I miscounted the points on like 5 exams, and I never did that again. So I bought a giant box of red pens that I'm slowly going through, and by the end of my career, I'll have gone through every single one of them. The textbook. The textbook has an evolving role, particularly if you're going to be recording lectures and asking students to watch something ahead of time. Good teachers have a hard time finding a good textbook because the better you get at anything in your life, the farther away your opinions will diverge from other people that are really good at something. And the textbook author knows quite a lot about the topic. As the instructor, you know quite a lot about the topic. So what are the odds that you're going to say that's the best way to teach this class? So especially in the quarter system, books are generally not written to be used in a quarter system. Consistent nomenclature, I've said this 3 times now, sorry. Source of homework problems or to dive deeper. So the role of the book, do you just want it for the problems in the back of the book, or do you want it as an extra source of information? The students, of course, prefer it where the book is pretty much exactly what was covered in class so that they can kind of read it at the same time. Let's say the median student prefers that. I preferred that. When the professor said the book it's supposed to be a completely different presentation of the course material, then I just threw the book in the corner and never opened it again and then sold it back to Barnes & Noble at the end. Are you going to ask them to read ahead of time or just as an extra? And don't support this bullshit that the publishers use where they release a new edition of the book every 2 years. Nonsense. Permit used copies unless you're going to assign specific problems from specific editions in the book. First time teaching a new, sometimes there's a new edition that's like 10 years, like 8 or 15 years later. Science can change in that amount of time, but there are other books, and you've seen these, where the science is not changing every 2 years. Calculus. First time teaching a new class. Teaching any class for the first time is a massive undertaking. The first quarter I was here, Nano 202, fall 2012. I actually rehearsed the lecture the night ahead of time every day for the first half of before every lecture for the first half of the course. I read the book 3 times. I took 2 sets of notes, and I rewrote the notes for a 3rd time in 2013. So the first set of notes that I wrote for the lecture, as I was going through them, I've decided this is crap. I don't know what I wrote. I need to rewrite them. And then the second time I taught the class, I rewrote them a 3rd time. And it took me seriously like a full-time job to teach a class that I'd never taken as a student. And I had very little theoretical background in. Subsequent years take, no joke, 90% less time, particularly if you had podcasted the lecture, and because you can download it and listen to it at 2.5 times speed, and you can listen to a 50-minute lecture in 20 minutes with your own notes in front of you before you give the lecture, and you kind of know what you're going to say. Now, does that make me feel really lame? That my point is just to regurgitate exactly what I said last year? Yes, hence the evolving role of the lecture and the fact that teaching is a work in progress for me and other people. If you're teaching at an institution where the lecture is not automatic by the podcast system, buy a recorder. The Zoom H1 recorder is a nice one. I have it. You can record with a 2 gigabyte micro SD card, like 20 hours of MP3 or something. Yes, listen to your own lecture. This is really helpful to at least get to the baseline of what you did last year. The goal is, of course, to improve, to continually improve your explanations and your jokes, which is, of course, important. But then once you've recorded the lecture, and this is the part that I'm actually going to ask for some discussion about maybe after this lecture, is once the class is video recorded, if you're going to video record it, or even if you're going to podcast it, what do you do with class time next year? If it's already on YouTube or equivalent, that would be like, it's already lame just to listen to your own podcast just so you can repeat it. It's really lame to watch your own video so you can repeat the video. So actually that I think the ubiquity of digital distribution and technology actually allows us to be a lot more innovative with what we do with this time. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, you will not know what you're talking about. And the goal here is to minimize this with the goal of never having it happen. But if it does, because sometimes when you're up in front of 150 people, you will forget your own name. Most people lose mental alacrity when speaking in front of 100+ conscious, judging beings. There's this idea that I have, or it's really a pantomime, of the difference between the depth of your knowledge and the level at which you're presenting your knowledge. Here's the level at which I'm presenting the knowledge, and here's the depth. Pretty good here, okay, not so good here. And then for a few minutes, in this moment, if somebody asks you a question, you're dead because there's nothing else in here. The only thing you know about the topic is what you put on the board. How many of you have had that experience as a TA? How many of us have had that experience as a professor? What if you don't know the answer to a question? This happens, by the way, not because professors are lazy or unintelligent, but rather, what are the odds that they need to use that information professionally in their daily lives? And they don't have any depth because there's no experience there with which to express more depth than what's actually in the lecture. There are three basic scenarios in increasing order of reprehensibility, let's say. Students ask for, not on the part of a student, on the part of the professor. Student asks for depth or example of an application. Okay, if you're in this regime, that's fine, you know. But if you're in this regime, you'll find out before office hours and encourage them to come to office hours and ask you about this depth or application. Student asks something about the course material, like details of a derivation, for example. Where did that factor of 2 come from? It's always a factor of 2. It's never 3. Factors of 2 and minus signs. I freaking hate factors of 2 and minus signs. Yes, it's on page blank, and write this in the notes. It might waste the entire class period to do an entire derivation, but if you give the key points of the concepts and how they relate to the derivation, because you don't want to derive something just to derive it, you want to derive it because there's some physical principle that you're trying to teach through the derivation. And in the notes that you're already putting online, say the full derivation could be found in the notes on this page. And then you could be snarky, minimize this one. Student asks about something you wrote on the board that you just can't explain. You're really in the scenario where you have no depth of knowledge about this, or you forgot, or you had some personal crisis the night before and you just didn't prepare to the extent that you should have. And I know I should not be admitting to having been in this scenario before, but in 5 years, over thousands of hours, it does happen. Maybe not thousands, maybe 1,000. And how do you get out of this? I understand the question. I just can't see it right now. I'll send an email to the class right after we're done. Thanks for your patience. That might be the best you can do. It happens to everybody. We are human. You might be on a job talk where there will be a teaching component you want to do. How many of you are interested in careers in education, university teaching, or think you might conceivably be interested? Okay, a good portion of people. So there might be a teaching component of the job talk. For academic job talks and also promotions, keep good records of the number of students you've taught. Keep the evaluations that you get. Write down comments from students. These are really important in promotions, that you have comments from the CAPE evaluations or from the grad student evaluations. The word philosophy, if you are 29 and you're applying for an assistant professor position and there are people ranging all the way to 70 years old in the audience who have been doing this for 40 years, and you're going to tell them, here's my philosophy on teaching. You don't know. Right. Ask questions to the committee. You may need to deliver a sample lecture. Make sure you prepare this well. Be familiar with the education literature. Yes, there is an education literature. Look up a few papers and get an idea of what people are actually thinking about and where the innovation is in university education. You might want to have an opinion on flipped classrooms and peer instruction and MOOCs and videos and the future of university education, and delight your audience as always. Closing thoughts. Many of us have already forgotten what it's like to be an undergraduate, and if you're in this classroom right now, you're either a really ambitious undergraduate because you're at a talk intended for grad students and postdocs, or you're a grad student, in which case you don't know what it's like to be a kind of median undergrad in terms of preparation and interest, because we're all really interested in learning. That's why we're grad students. For the above, so you aim your course material for the above average student because you want people to rise above the average, but you also want to make yourself available to the people who really want to get more out of the class. Have compassion, but don't cave too easily. Importance of grades depends on who your audience is. Vastly different between undergrads. Grades are everything. Grads, nobody cares about your grades. Particularly PhD students. Students will get emotional. Refer students in trouble to trained professionals, and other resources on general education at Harvard by Edward O. Wilson, undergraduate education at Harvard by G.M. Whitesides. It's not that Harvard had all the insight in education, it's just that I know these particular people, and I think that their stuff is really good and useful on this topic. Eric Mazur, this is really the founder of or one of the founders of the peer instruction flipped classroom kind of idea. It's really worth watching some of his lectures. There are a ton of them on YouTube. And if you want to see if I practice what I preach, you can watch my lectures. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.